Back home now, eThekwini has experienced a number of shootings in recent weeks. Last week, 7 people were shot dead under a railway bridge in KwaMashu in a suspected vigilante hit. Police arrived on the scene just before midnight after receiving reports of several dead bodies on the corner of the busy Malandela Road and the M25 off-ramp. The bodies were found lying next to a pillar in a straight line with gunshot wounds to the head and body. Now, let's discuss this. We're now joined by Professor Nirmala Gopal, a criminologist from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Prof, thank you so much for your time. You know, I remember speaking to you just last month, and in that space, we've had so many incidences of gun violence, and it seems to be continuing unabated in KwaZulu-Natal. Prof, what are the root causes of these shootings and the rate of the escalation?
Good afternoon, Anati, and good afternoon to your listeners. Yes, I think, first of all, it's really sad that the spate of killings is actually increasing. In terms of what causes this kind of violent killings, I think there are multiple factors that could inform these kinds of killings. You know, they could be personal vendettas, which to me seems like what the case is with the current spate of killings. Personal vendettas, drug-related, gang-related, alcohol-related, or primarily just greed. At the most basic level, it could just be greed. But I think in addition to that, Unati, one of the things that concerns me, and I think researchers and like-minded criminologists across the country, is why do these criminals believe that they could just go around killing people in the first instance, and the fact that they, in all probability, believe that they won't be apprehended? So I think that's a huge concern for us.
And one of the things that we talked about, Prof, and I'm going to come back to what you talked about in terms of vigilantism, but just going back to the patterns that we are currently seeing, you know, in the weeks. I mean, we know that there are, as you've also alluded to, a number of reasons behind these attacks. But there is concern, of course, that these will further increase as we head, you know, to the festive season. What role is law enforcement playing here?
So I think the law enforcement has to play a very critical role, and that critical role is to secure civilians and, of course, apprehend criminals. So I think in terms of how law enforcement actually prepares for this period, is that they need to increase visibility, and they need to increase visibility in hotspots especially. But in addition to that, they need to increase visibility in areas that will be highly populated during the festive season. Because whilst we want to focus on hotspots, that is areas where criminal activity is high, we also want to make sure that our civilians who are tourists, etc., who are visiting your leisure spaces, we want to make sure that they feel equally comfortable, safe, and secure. So I think increasing police visibility in a number of spaces is going to be really critical for law enforcement.
And another thing that you mentioned a little bit earlier, Prof, is, you know, vigilantism. I mean, what is the sign here? Is it a sign that people have lost faith in the justice system, in law enforcement authorities? Because when you look at some of these cases, you know, we're told that it could be a community that is frustrated, that has identified a criminal underworld, particularly in the drug space, and they took the law onto themselves.
I mean, if we're getting that kind of intelligence coming through, where the communities are taking the law into their own hands, in all probability, what it points to is the lack of trust in the South African police services. And that is really not a good sign for our democratic country.
When you start looking at, just the patterns as we head to the festive season, of course, there are other concerns. as we head to the elections next year, that this could be even workings of a much bigger group of a syndicate, particularly when you start looking at political killings. A concern, of course, is also, the prominence of the construction mafia, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. I mean, just recently, a chief had been killed. He was also killed, in front of his wife. She was also killed. And of course, political parties have condemned this. When it comes to that, what sort of intelligence should we be seeing from police? I mean, just before coming to this interview, we were condemning what is happening in Hamas-Israel war, where thousands of people are being killed. But we are having the same situation in our own backyard, where every single week we have more than one, gun killing, mass shootings occurring.
Absolutely, Unati. You rightfully point out, that's a war situation, and we are not in a war situation, and yet we are equally concerned about the levels of violence and the numbers of, the homicide levels, etc. So just to go back to your earlier question, looking at the construction mafia, the drug lords, people responsible for gang violence, etc. I think it's a very intricate web that we're dealing with, and it's very complex at the same time. And I think what is very critical for the South African police services to do is to disaggregate all of these killings and try to look at the patterns and the trends. Are they political? Are they drug related? Are they economically related? Are they personal vendettas, etc.? So they need to use their intelligence to be able to disaggregate the factors or the drivers for these various types of violence. And I think once they are able to disaggregate those, they will then be able to do predictions, and they should be doing predictions in terms of, will the political violence increase closer to the elections? And if their trajectory is pointing to an increase, then they need to intervene appropriately. If it's drug related, and if their pointers are showing to an increase, then of course, again, they need to intervene appropriately. So I think what is just so critical, and SABC doesn't do this well enough, is to work with criminologists, researchers, universities, to come up with more viable solutions that are empirically based. So if we could have this conversation between SAPs and researchers and, higher education institution criminologists, I think we would go further in terms of winning this war against especially violent crime in South Africa. But just to recap, disaggregating the nature, the extent of the various types of violence is going to be extremely critical in our way forward.
But Prof, as we are talking, and when you look at just certain articles that have been written, there are concerns that, to what end are we going to see this violence? Because it is escalating at an alarming rate. Should there be perhaps a judicial body, and as you rightfully point out, that actually looks at it from a different vantage point, where criminal work and forensic investigation work is done, and also uses of experts like yourself is also done. Because what is happening in KwaZulu-Natal now is probably going to reach a stage where this will enter into civilian space, which probably will be too late then for police to intervene.
Exactly, Unati. So I think if we look at trends and we look at the political killings in the 80s, I really think that unless we, when we look at the trends and the patterns during the 80s, unless we understand what caused those at a very deep-rooted level, and we use those lessons to try and counter what could possibly lead up to the 2024 elections, I can safely say I believe that we're going to see an increase in political killings. The political arena has just become so competitive for a variety of reasons. And through that competition, life becomes meaningless. And as a consequence, then we find that these random killings are taking place. But of course, they're not as random as we think they are because they're linked to a particular motive. So leading up to the elections, in all probability, we're going to see an increase, and hopefully SABC is capacitated to counter an increase if we start to see that.
Prof, let's leave it there for now. Thank you so much for your time and your analysis this afternoon. Professor Nirmala Gopal is a criminologist at the University of KwaZulu-Natal.